In other words, there is now going to be a huge amount of data available. And the only question is how to collect it as meticulously, as carefully as possible. In other words, I think this is a whole new world. And finding evidence and presenting it will be a lot less difficult than was the case in previous conflicts. First point. Second point, everybody knows, I suppose, that Russia has not ratified, is not a member of the existing tribunal in The Hague. But leaving aside the question, and I really don't know the answer to that, whether it is possible to construct a truly international tribunal which would be somehow mandated by the UN against firm opposition by the Russian Federation. Leaving aside that question for a moment, there are of course huge opportunities at the national and at the international level. Don't forget that recently a local German court convicted some perpetrators from the Sudanese conflict, and they're going to jail. These people had fled to Europe and were arrested. And in other words, justice, meting out justice, is possible for these types of war crimes, even in the absence of a working, fully internationalized and mandated tribunal.
International justice is the most conservative legal procedure, most conservative. What we failed in the MH17 case is that we failed to prove at certain stage the intentional actions of Russian Federation, and then it took us another years and years of collecting evidences to do this. So that's why we need to collect all this data with as precision as possible and to be as patient as possible in terms of pursuing this justice, because this is the most conservative justice. But we have all these elements of actually developing unique legal instruments of punishing Russia.
I think that we're quite far from this from this question, because I'm personally concerned with the practical issues and the practical side of how we're going to establish this tribunal, because who's going to mandate it? It is quite obvious that the UN Security Council will veto, Russia in UN Security Council will veto it, and the UN will not mandate it. As they did with MH17, they did not allow us to establish international tribunal on that. What we did that, and I think that Taras Kachka, the participant of this case, could tell us more about that. But what Ukraine did is 5 countries that suffered from MH17. It's Ukraine, Canada, Malaysia, and so on. They handed over the jurisdiction to the Dutch criminal court to investigate this case and to prosecute this case. In this case, and this may be a solution for Ukraine, but we have to discuss who will be on board with that and who will have the jurisdiction over these cases. We have a good sign of 40 countries now joining us in the case Ukraine versus Russia, in the so-called genocide case already. So the coalition is quite clear, it is firm, and we understand that we will...
What's the forum there, where the 40 countries have joined?
It is a case in International Criminal Court, Court of Justice, sorry. We have the signs that we will have this coalition when it comes to establishing the tribunal, but the details, they matter and they are not clear at the moment.
The first thing that I think is important is to keep the thinking as broad as possible about how and what we might be prosecuting in the future. So across the spectrum of war crimes, aggressive war, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, I'm all in favor of at least thinking very big. In particular, I think all four of those have been met, and for me, it's quite important to have genocide be a subject of discussion, because after all, there is a body of law about it, and all five of the criteria in Section 2 have been met. And that is to say, the Russian occupying forces have committed all five crimes, each of which severally constitutes genocide. The only possible question would be the intentionality around it. And scholars of genocide have, quite, I think, convincingly shown that when you talk about a nation not existing, that's a declaration of your intention to destroy it. And Mr. Putin has repeatedly and serially talked about the non-existence of the Ukrainian nation. And so you have, and then within Ria Novosti and other very central Russian media, you have these open declarations of intent to make Ukraine no longer exist. And we know that what both denazification and decommunization actually mean de-Ukrainization. I mean, the Russian discourse about this is actually, I find as a historian of genocide, it's actually unusual for the discourse of genocide to be this clear while it's happening. I mean, usually the perpetrators do a better job of trying to dissuade people from the notion that what they're doing is committing genocide. It's almost as though Russian authorities are advertising that this is their intention. So my first main observation is that I think we have to be keeping all four of those on the table, and that genocide is particularly important because whether or not we end up being able to prosecute it in some forum, which is a question I have to leave to people who know better than me, it helps to define usefully what's going on, also for people inside the Russian Federation, also for the people who will be making judgments about these events later on. So that's where I'll start, Gideon.
This whole use of the term genocide, I understand that there's a lot of legal definitions out there, but I think to the public it's still a bit confusing. So that when the Chinese are accused of genocide in Uyghur, against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, people say, well, what they're doing is terrible, but it's not mass murder. And I think people think of genocide as mass murder. Why is it still the right term here?
So that I think precisely that's a wonderful question, because I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is actually such a textbook example of genocide that it gives us a chance to clarify what the legal definition actually is. So as a historian in my historical work, I never use the word genocide for the reason that you've just given, which is that there are two definitions at work in the popular mind. In the popular mind, some genocide can mean trying to kill every single person, which is a very high standard, right? Met, perhaps once, but not very many times in history. But then there is the actual legal definition of genocide, which was created with the Holocaust in mind, but not only the Holocaust, also the Armenian genocide, also the Holodomor. And the legal definition of genocide is very interesting because it has to do with the attempt to destroy, in whole or in part, a people. Right? And that attempt can take, as we know from history, that attempt can take various forms. It need not be the literal, mechanized, physical murder of every single person. It can also include things like taking children away from their parents and educating them in a different culture, which applies, for example, to Canadian treatment of Native peoples, but also applies to the deportation of Ukrainian children far away into Russia with the hope that they will simply assimilate. I mean, so if one looks at Russian deportation of Ukrainian citizens, these are disproportionately women and children, and they're being spread all around Russia with the very clear intention, it seems to me, of treating them as human raw material who will assimilate or whose children will be assimilated. That is actually genocidal intent according to the law. So there are also things which are quite clearly dramatic, like mass rape, where where genocidal language is used around the crime itself, or the murder of civilians, where genocidal language is used around the crime itself. But what's striking to me is that here we have a head of state who personally has said multiple times this nation doesn't exist, and whose major press services, not to mention television, I mean, I don't know how many of you are following Russian television, but proclamations of genocidal intent are just found very fast and thick on Russian television all the time. But on the official news service, RIA Novosti, there have been at least 2 texts, one right after the war began and one a few weeks ago, which made it quite clear that what was meant by denazification is actually the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. So I think this is actually a clarifying opportunity for us to talk about how horrible it is to aspire to destroy a nation, even though that can take various kinds of forms. I mean, and the reason why, sadly and horribly, the Russian example is so instructive is that they're doing all of them at the same time. They're doing the separation of children, they're doing the deportation, they're doing the murder, right? I mean, pretty much everything that you can do according to the Genocide Convention of 1948, they're doing at the same time.
Second question, genocide. So if we go to the, first of all, of course, definition of genocide, and then when we go deeply and analyze everything what's been told by Russians officials, I mean, Putin, his article, which Timothy just several months ago on Yes conference been discussing, and other official statements which Putin made and officials made, it was everything about ignoring existence of Ukrainian nation. It was everything about destroying Ukrainian nation. And then when we go after this and we see what is happening on the ground, the evidences of this war, the main target, civilians. There are a lot of like millions, almost a million of Ukrainians deported. It is this one more sign of genocide. Third question, of course, it is raping, massive raping, not just women, but young girls, and they are using raping as sexual violence as a weapon. Why they are doing this? First of all, they want Ukrainian women even to ignore their nature, that they are women. Many of them, the outcome of this raping, they don't want to bring life to this world, They don't want to be women, they don't want to be mothers. What is this? Of course it's genocide. And the last, and also very important, if you look to the main destructions and to the map of these destructions, it is everything about critical infrastructure. It is everything about destroying the infrastructure, just that it would be impossible to live in Ukraine for ordinary people.
Genocide is also a mood, like it's a way of carrying out war. It's a kind of motivation, and that is very much present among Russian soldiers and in the Russian media today. It's a way of being. My colleague Jason Stanley wrote an article about genocide as a form of identity, and I'm afraid he's right. And I'm afraid that we're there, and we see it in the motivation, the announced motivation of how Russians behave in the field. I mean, it's a terrible way to describe it, but it's almost like it's a kind of alternative morality. Like genocide is not just the absence of something; it's the presence of something else. And I find that that's almost palpable in the sources that we have. And something I forgot to mention, which I think is also good evidence for genocidal intent, is the deliberate decoration by the president of the Russian Federation of war criminals. I mean, he's deliberately decorating the people who are not just that they are war criminals, but the people who are notorious for being war criminals. So he's affirming what you referred to, citing Professor Hastings as excess that's being affirmed.
I actually had the honor of being in a panel recently with the British historian Max Hastings, and he said the challenge for all armies in all ages is to cherish warrior virtues while rejecting warrior excesses. And actually, Russia is doing exactly the opposite. They are cherishing warrior excesses by committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, the crime of crimes, genocide, and the crime of aggression. All of these crimes under international law, they qualify differently, and they must be regarded by different judicial institutions. This is why when we talk about the International Criminal Court, which must regard one type of claims. When we're talking about the crime of aggression, the International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction over that. So this is why Ukraine is set on setting up a special tribunal against regard the case against Russian aggression. And when we're talking about the International Court of Justice, there are cases there already under consideration. The big question is, for not just for Ukraine and us Ukrainians, but for the international community, is how prepared are we to live with the plague of aggression in the world? How prepared and can we afford to live actually next to a disease-ridden nation, which today is Russia under Putin's rule, which is infecting the rest of the world with aggression, xenophobia, with the disease of the mind, which is spread by the propaganda which Putin is spreading all the time. And I think that the question is here demands a very clear answer, and that answer should be no every time that we ask those questions. We are not prepared to live in such a world. And this is where I turn to, again, to international law and the doctrine of state responsibilities, and that says very clearly. So the first step should be for the internationally illegal act to stop. That is the act of aggression. That must be stopped. And here we need a consolidated effort from the international community to help stop the act of Russia's aggression. We need weapons. We need financial aid for Ukraine. We need more sanctions and all the way in sanctions against Russia. And we need that to be going on for a little while longer at the moment. After the act of aggression is stopped, we cannot say that that's it, full stop, this is victory, because that's not how international responsibility of states work. In the draft articles on responsibility of states of 2001, it says clearly that after aggression is stopped or any illegal act is stopped by a state, there must be a guarantee of non-repetition, and that's state must give that guarantee. The only way to push for that guarantee and to make it real is to make the wrongdoer pay, to have reparations set in place. And the main question that we should be asking each other and the global community really is, how are we going to make Russia pay for all the crimes, all the damage, all the harm inflicted in Ukraine, but also all the damage and the losses caused to the allies of Ukraine, who have been very good in helping us with weapons and helping us with introduction of sanctions and financial aid, humanitarian aid, because all of these need to be accounted for as well. So there's something that Ukraine could be doing already at national level, and we are doing this. There's a draft law, which I think actually everyone in this panel and in this room who's a member of parliament co-signed. It's a draft law on a consolidated claim against Russia, meaning that an agency should be set up in Ukraine, the sole work of which should be to count the damage and the harms inflicted by Russia on Ukraine. That law is under consideration in parliamentary committees and hopefully will be in parliament soon. That will make the challenge of presenting the evidence and having a set number much easier. The second step is, of course, to consolidate international efforts around pushing for justice, for international justice, which is needed for the victims who have suffered directly from Russia's aggression and from Russia's war crimes, but also which is needed for the international community to be confident about reinstating international law as we know it today, about reinstating a belief in democracy and a belief in all the principles about which we so often talk in all the different panels. Once that is done, I think none of us have the illusion here that Russia will willingly come forward and say, okay, well, since there's a court ruling, that's it, we're going to pay out all the damage, whatever the sum of money you put at the end of the check. No, Russia's never going to do that, at least not under this leadership, and at least not if it's not reformed from the inside. So the challenge here is, what can we do? Well, first of all, I see that sanctions cannot be lifted unless and until Russia pays. This should be a clear baseline. Second is the fact that Russia can be made to pay with all the assets, with all the property that they have outside of Russia. But for that to be a reality, the countries that are our allies, that are our partners, sometimes will need to change their laws to allow in their national legislation to confiscate the assets and the property owned by Russia and to transfer it in the form of compensation and restitution for all of the damage caused in Ukraine. And finally, the doctrine of state immunities, that will have to be reviewed as well. Based on the principle that the immunities, states have immunities to protect their sovereignty, but not in any case to allow them to breach the sovereignty of other states.
Do you expect Putin sitting on the bench in the court? Like physically? Let's be realistic. I don't think that it's going to happen, because it is absolutely different from Nuremberg process. We are living in nuclear age. And also, let's be fair, the main fear of the civilized countries, it is about nuclear war. And that's why we need to be realistic, and yes, we don't expect him sitting on the bench, but we expect that he is going to be in the court. And in this case, without special tribunal, without in absentia process, without also withdrawing state impunity, it would be impossible. And there is no scheme, there is no rules in the present judicial system, international judicial system, how to do this. That's why without special tribunal, setting up the special tribunal, it would be impossible to bring him to justice.
We should clearly not separate Putin from Russian society, because they are collective Putin. Because people who come to Ukraine and rape our women, children, who kill our civilians, they are the result of brainwashing machine, but they're collective Putin. And actually, we should not think that let's remove sanctions because Russian population suffers from some economic losses. They cannot pay with their banking credit card abroad. But I think that, well, they're responsible. They have elected him. The majority of them, let's say, keep silent now or observing, or they just agree with his policy. And this is highly important, that we should not be pity, maybe. That only 11% of GDP drop in Russia is expected this year compared to 45 GDP drop in Ukraine. So this is highly important.
And for me, if Putin wins, it doesn't mean he will win the war, but if he wins with no responsibility from the Russian side, from the international tribunal, from him personally, from the oligarchs that surround him, of the business circles, it will mean that actually, as Zelensky said today here in Davos, what are we talking about? Why are we talking about international humanitarian law? Why are we talking about democracy? The pure force doesn't need those discussions. The pure force doesn't care. It's just using the pure force, the money, the tanks, the weapons. And what are those discussions worth if with them and with all of our belief in democracy and humanitarian law, we are not able not just to stop and prevent, we didn't do that, but even to make it pay for that so that in the future it will not be repeated.
But one of the reasons you prosecute, or you try to prosecute, or you talk about prosecuting, is that it defines who you are, as opposed to who the other side is. And even if it doesn't lead to a conclusion, the way that you define your norms for yourself at a critical moment will be remembered, right? So I mean, we are still 70, 80 years on almost. talking about Nuremberg and its problems, because there were lots of problems with Nuremberg, because Nuremberg is supposed to be an expression of what America was back then, right? And 80 years from now in Ukraine, you know, students will be thinking about how you prosecuted or tried to prosecute, right? So it's not only about who they are, it's also about who you are. And then I guess the final thing I wanted to say is this point about the global South has also been very much on my mind. And, you know, because I think that the history of Ukraine has to be understood as part of a global history of colonization, and the history of Russian Empire actually works very nicely with the general history of empire. But most people don't agree with me. And there's a lot of work to be done in that respect. And a lot of what we do in the study of Ukraine is actually what people in imperial history think of as decentering or as post-colonial history, but that's not a vocabulary which Ukrainians generally have yet, but it's pretty important. But on the legal stuff, there is a whole legal tradition, especially around the UN ruling on self-determination in 1961. There's a whole third world legal tradition which you might try to seize on. That there's a whole legal language around self-determination, which was the anti-colonial legal language, and it might pay off in this conversation for you to appropriate that, to take that over, because it does very much apply to your case, and then that speaks to a history which maybe some friends in the global South will. A defense of something which is not quite law, but which is important. Going back to have we learned nothing from the last 80 years? I think it's not quite as bad as all that. I mean, I think that the European Union is. It's interesting that the European Union is out front of individual nation states. I find that very interesting, that the European Union itself is out front of individual member states, and that suggests to me that perhaps we have learned something. Which is that that sometimes collective solutions work out better than individual solutions. And I mean, for all that Germany is making me crazy, every day with its extraordinarily self-absorbed debates about Ukraine, nevertheless, the centering of Germany within a larger legal community has made some difference, right? And I look forward, and we think broadly about how the world should react to Russian war crimes in Ukraine. That reaction need not only be a legal reaction. I mean, for me, that reaction, the sensible reaction is, it's one more reason why Ukraine belongs in the European Union, right? Because if there is a big Western legal instrument which actually makes a difference in history, it is membership in the European Union. So one of my answers, maybe that's something that people don't see. I mean, one of my answers is, well, the Europeans should react by saying that it's absolutely morally obvious that Ukraine should be a member of the European Union.
The reason why you're getting the 40 billion whatever from the US, and there is so much support coming in, I'm afraid is partly because of the war crimes. You could see public opinion turning as Mariupol was happening, as the revelations were coming in. There has been a cost to Russia, because it's shown itself for what it is as a result of this war. So, although it seems that he's acting with impunity, the cost has already been immense. He would be in a far stronger military position if he wouldn't have been doing it in the first place if the genocidal impulses hadn't been there. But the fact is that if he'd just done it as a straightforward military operation, he would probably be in a far better position than the brutality with which he does. Very little consolation to many Ukrainians, but I think it's a consequence of how he's done it.
I just wanted to comment on whether we are repeating the history all the time. I think we are repeating it, but I think we are learning faster because of a globalized world, because of the internet, because of the news spreading very fast. We were actually told that this war is the first war which is the most digitalized and online documented war in history, which spreads all over with the support of, democratic institutions. So we might learn much faster.